morning, WTOB listeners. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law. I'm Dylan Greenwood, managing partner here at Greenwood Law, along with Jessica Armentrout, family law attorney. We've got a very special guest with us here today, and that is Dr. Samuel Gray of Carolina Psychology Group. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Gray.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. We're here today because we want to discuss a topic that we get called about frequently from a family law perspective, and that is divorcing a narcissist. I don't know how many times you've come into my office.
But yeah, it's not even as much calls. It's just everybody blames the failure of their relationship. My ex is a narcissist. And
Right.
I guess one of the things we get into today is what a layperson's definition of narcissist is. We all think of it as being kind of obsessed with yourself, which I guess it is, but there's a lot more to it from the clinical perspective, I suppose, which is what Dr. Gray is here to explain to us.
Right. And so we're going to get to every bit of that, including, just in general, how these divorce proceedings go, potential issues that might come up with child custody. I mean, there's all sorts of things where this could really play out. And then whether or not, someone actually really is a true narcissist. So just to get all of this started, Dr. Gray, based off of, what you hear, what you see, what is actually a true clinical narcissist versus what someone might think of as somebody being a narcissist or displaying narcissistic tendencies?
Yeah, well, I think that it's not unusual for folks to believe or assume that someone has narcissistic personality disorder based on some level of arrogance or haughtiness or certain behavior. From a clinical perspective, the diagnosis is much more involved, and really it's more based on the severity of those kinds of traits that meets the criteria to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. All personality disorders kind of occur across a spectrum. Some people have more severe symptoms and some have minor symptoms, and so but I'm going to just read off to you just the basic symptoms to diagnose narcissistic personality disorder, just so you understand, and we can start from that base. So individuals with narcissistic personality typically have a pattern of sort of grandiosity, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy for others. The symptom criteria include a grandiose sense of self-importance. These are folks who expect to be recognized as superior even if they don't have commensurate achievements to do that. They tend to be preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. These folks they believe they're special and unique. They can only be understood or should associate with other high or special status people or institutions. They require excessive admiration. They have a sense of entitlement. They expect others to comply with their expectations. They're frequently are interpersonally exploitive and take advantage of others without much thought of it. They tend to lack empathy, unwilling to recognize needs and feelings of others. Envious, they're frequently jealous of others, or they believe others are envious of them. And they show arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So that's the diagnostic criteria. And really, to diagnose it, these symptoms have to be significant enough to be causing some type of clinical impairment in their life, either in their social functioning, occupationally, or emotionally. And so we say clinically significant impairment. That rises to a standard that sometimes people may not quite appreciate when they're diagnosing their loved one or a spouse with something like this.
So it isn't just as simple as being like very resilient or very self-confident. It goes beyond that. It affects relationships. It affects how you approach certain things. It has this pervasive impact on your life. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, it has a pervasive impact on your life, and you can imagine if someone's kind of going through that situation and they're assuming that they're always right. They're assuming that they have more power. They're assuming that they have rights to special status and those kinds of things. You can see how that's going to impact their daily life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, when it you're looking at someone with narcissistic tendencies. I think we were, pining before we even talked on the program today about how, the initial part of the relationship can be pretty good because, a narcissistic person is the life of the party, very charismatic, or can be. And then, all of a sudden, things could change. So do you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, most folks who have narcissistic personality disorder or even just narcissistic tendencies tend to make really good first impressions. They tend to be sort of bright and lively and energetic, and they really attract the attention of other people, and that's part of their disorder. But initially, they can be, a lot of fun to be around. It's typically once someone has developed a more meaningful or longer relationship with them that the shallow nature of that is exposed.
I see. So, going through a relationship, sometimes, all of a sudden you go through a relationship, you get married, and then sometimes those marriages don't work out. So in the state of North Carolina, Jessica, if somebody is contemplating divorce, what typically has to happen?
Typically, you have to be separated for a year in North Carolina to get a divorce, so you really just have to move out is what you have to do. But you sort of have to contemplate how your spouse is going to react, how they're going to fight with you about the money issues or the alimony issues, or if they're going to be willing to see their own flaws in this or admit some kind of responsibility, or just kind of insist that it was your fault the whole time. And that does make for a tougher case sometimes, regardless of the attorneys involved, if a person just won't kind of give and accept that maybe both people had some part in this relationship. But I've noticed where the person that's narcissistic, or allegedly, narcissistic, they obviously don't give for all the reasons we talked about. But then the person that feels like they're the victim, they won't give either because they feel like they've been so mistreated by this narcissist that they shouldn't have to. And I don't know, is that its own kind of narcissism maybe, or self-involvement, or maybe I'm projecting now like I think my clients are?
Well, I think that it's for a narcissist who's going through a divorce situation. Narcissistic folks are by nature hyper competitive. As we said before, they lack empathy. If a relationship looks like it's going to end, it's not going to impact them emotionally very much. That they're not going to be bothered by the loss of the relationship, and that might really offend the person they've been in the relationship with, because they're tending to be very shallow and they don't have the empathy to appreciate the pain or suffering that the other person is going through. And so they will probably, because they're hyper competitive, they're probably going to react in more of an aggressive way and really start to fight at that point. So I can see how that frequently will pull folks farther apart in that situation.
And also, based off what you described, it seems like they would view it as all the blame is on the other person.
Absolutely.
Not on them. Not being able to, reflect and look in the mirror and say, well, I might have had a hand to play here.
Right. No, I mean, certainly the narcissist is going to spend a lot of time looking in the mirror, but not for any faults. So what they're going to be looking for is, what did the other person do? And I'm great, and I did everything right here, and that other person's to blame. And they'll do that in their daily life in any matter. So in a situation like a divorce, that's going to be amplified.
Right.
And so they're not likely to take responsibility for anything, certainly the loss of a relationship.
So the lack of empathy sort of sounds almost like, is it a psychopath or a sociopath? Is there... I can't remember
psychopathy, yes. Lack of empathy, and it's a good point. It's also part of the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, which is more of a criminogenic personality disorder, which we see in a lot more criminal cases. Mm-hmm. But the lack of empathy is also part of narcissism. And so those personality disorders overlap, and it's not unusual to see folks who meet the criteria for both personality disorders, both antisocial and narcissistic personality disorder.
So how do you find narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder traits impact someone's ability to parent their child? Does it kind of make them focus on not the child, or does it make it focus on the child because it's a way to get back at the other, or how does that play
Well,
out?
it can vary, certainly in different situations, and I think we were talking about this a little bit before the show, but I think frequently what I've seen in those marriages and relationships is that once someone who has narcissistic personality disorder has children, the dynamic of the relationship will change significantly. And so the narcissist is someone who's used to getting all the attention from their spouse or their partner. And so they're likely to be disturbed by the fact that attention is now being shifted to the children naturally. And so the loss of that attention is going to cause distress and discomfort for them. And that's when they're likely to start acting out and trying to gain more attention. They probably are going to become jealous or envious of their own children because they're getting more attention from the spouse. And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, but it's usually not a positive outcome.
So, in a situation like that, I understand exactly what you're saying, but after the separation and divorce takes place, especially if the children are old enough to kind of know some of these upper levels or abstract-y type things, could all of a sudden that shift from the desire for adoration, the desire for attention, could that focus shift from the spouse that they were potentially getting it from, or maybe not, to all of a sudden trying to get that from the children in an unhealthy way?
Yeah, it can. And I think the other thing that happens if a narcissist believes that winning a custody situation or having children in their custody is going to make them look better or appear better on the surface to other people, they will fight for that, and they will use the children or whatever means necessary to try to win that because they want to ultimately look good. And so they may even feign care and attention for the children in order to basically get that status to be that parent who has custody, who has the children. And so, again, they may act in all kinds of ways to try to gain that attention.
Even before parents separate, I mean, obviously, and after, but before they separate, do you find a narcissist might project more onto their children as far as being more obsessed with what the children accomplish and do because it's a reflection on them?
I think that's true, and I think it's not unusual to see them, put their own children on a pedestal, maybe even without commensurate achievement, to indulge them, to, insist that they're the best at whatever. And so, and that can be certainly harmful to children who are not allowed to kind of experience the normal sort of failures and humility of childhood. If the parent's not allowing them to do that, that can impact them. And it can also contribute to the potential that they may develop narcissistic personality disorder. Because if your parents, and that's, if they're putting you on a pedestal, if they're not really holding you accountable, if you can do no wrong, you can kind of see how that can translate into an adult, narcissistic personality.
So that is kind of where I was going with that too, is can you make your child a narcissist? Is it a nature versus nurture thing? Is there any indication it's hereditary? Or, like I said, can you kind of create that monster? Or maybe some of both?
Yeah, some of both. I think what the research says is that, directly it's not so much of a hereditary connection. However, there are certain hereditary traits that can contribute to or increase the risk of someone developing a narcissistic personality disorder. So, for example, if someone is, carries a personality trait of, more of a kind of a depressive state or even kind of an isolated type personality, or somebody who's more introverted, I should say, those types of personality traits might increase their risk to develop narcissistic personality disorder. But the nurture piece is so important, as we talked about, because if someone is indulging and they're not allowing their children to experience failure and to work through those kinds of experiences, then they're more likely to develop narcissism in adulthood.
So how prevalent would you say narcissism is? Like, again, everybody thinks that they've been with one if they're unhappy with their relationship, and sometimes they're right, but how prevalent is it among the population? Is it increasing or decreasing? Do we even know? How, I guess, is the worst end of the spectrum increasing? The smaller end? Is that a function of just there's more out there, or we know how to diagnose it better?
Yeah, I think the epidemiology studies are showing right now it's roughly somewhere up to 6% of the population. And there are also studies that are showing that it is increasing, as well as some other personality disorders. So it's a little bit concerning to all of us that those are increasing in frequency, that we will see more folks with these types of disorders, and we should be more attentive to that.
Is it also increasing in severity as well?
I haven't seen the studies that say that it's increasing in severity necessarily, but I think it's fair to assume that that's a good possibility.
Why, in those studies and things that you read, what are some indications, if any, as to why that's happening?
Well, I think there's certainly been a lot of sort of cultural shifts, and if you look at the child rearing behaviors and some of the I try not to be political here, but I think there's different values within families and things that have changed over the years, and so I think also things are just so much easier. Certainly with internet technologies and things, it's things have become a lot easier, and so that has certainly been some hypotheses that have been raised about why that's the case, but I don't know that that's definitive.
Yeah, I will say my mind immediately went to device usage, social media usage, because it is so easy to, kind of wrapped up in sort of your own little world. There's kind of, you joke around and you think about, the young kids that are all in the same room together that could be talking but are on their cell phones texting each other instead of actually verbally communicating.
Yeah, and you also think about what you're projecting to other people on these social media sites and things like that. What does your page look like, and are you basically just building all your accomplishments up and telling everyone
your best self, right?
How great you are, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that certainly lends itself to people developing maybe inaccurate views of their own self and accomplishments.
And then, of course, witnessing that from other people also keeps that ball rolling from another end that can lead to possible depression. It can also lead to, all of a sudden you feel like you've got to do that. And so you're placing a value on constantly projecting some your best self on the internet as well. So it's really kind of a ball that keeps rolling. It's a ball of double-edged swords in a way.
Yeah. And I think too, the other thing is that, folks with narcissistic personality disorder frequently or at some point in their life will suffer what we consider a narcissistic injury, which, is usually where someone has challenged them or insulted them or sort of broken down that sense of, grandiosity. And when that happens, it's not unusual to see folks with narcissistic personality dive into a depressive kind of state. And in other cases, they may become hostile in those situations. So when we look at some of the criminal kinds of situations and some civil as well, it's not unusual when these kinds of narcissistic injuries happen to see a reaction that can be either hostile, which there's some research that shows that interpersonal violence is more likely with folks with narcissistic personality disorder, or to sort of fall into that sort of depressive state and probably increase their risk for things like suicidal ideation.
So, obviously that's a big concern. If someone out there is contemplating divorcing someone who actually is a narcissist, do they need to worry that that is one of those potential triggering events that could be a narcissistic injury?
I think you should always be on alert for that kind of stuff. They're probably, if they've been in a longer term relationship with that person, they probably already have a sense of whether that person's sort of likely to be violent or get into a depressed state or things like that. And if they're already aware that that's something that someone has a tendency to do, then I think you would want to make sure that person has supports around them to make sure that
built-in safeguards.
Right.
And, there are plenty of resources out there to be safeguards for situations like that. Here in Forsyth County, for instance, we have Safe on 7 that people can go to. They're very helpful when it comes to trying to get restraining orders and things of that nature. And plus, there's always that possibility of using the criminal justice system for actual if there are actual violent occurrences that might take place. So,
and there's also, not to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but there's a mobile crisis teams. Most counties have mobile crisis units that operate out of their managed care organization, the mental health authority in their area, that they can reach out to, and those mobile crisis units will actually come out and evaluate folks on the spot. So,
okay. If you're just joining us here on WTOB, this is Dylan Greenwood, Jessica Armentrout, and Dr. Samuel Gray here on For the Record with Greenwood Law, and we're talking today about divorcing a narcissist and going through those types of proceedings with someone who displays a significant personality disorder like that. So just real quick, Dr. Gray, when it comes to court proceedings, negotiations, any of that type of stuff, mediation, where you got to go back and forth with somebody like this, what could someone potentially expect if their ex is a narcissist on the other end of that?
well, I think it's reasonable to expect that individuals with narcissistic personality disorder are going to have more excuses. They're going to feel more justified. They're going to feel more justified in violating rules, violating norms, violating the rights of others, and they're likely to do it without much appreciation for how that's impacting others. And so I think you can expect that that's the approach you will get. Clearly, if you're trying to appeal to a narcissist, you're going to do so through giving them admiration. And so if you're trying to sort of get them to work in the same direction as you, then you may want to consider how you can sort of compliment them in that way, to sort of move them maybe in your direction. You have to be careful, of course, in doing that, because they're going to try to take advantage of that situation. So they're probably going to be pretty difficult to move off of their kind of belief system.
So, Dr. Gray, what is your background in dealing with these things in the court system? I mean, I have a little bit of experience with you in a custody case. So is that sort of a lot of what you do? Are you working in the criminal arena too and seeing people with these issues?
Yeah, so my full-time job is working as chief psychologist for Methodist Home for Children, which is a not-for-profit out of Raleigh. And what they've asked me to do is to oversee 3 juvenile clinics across the state where we evaluate juvenile offenders. In addition to that, I have a private practice, Carolina Psychology Group, where I do primarily forensic practice and do both civil and criminal matters. And so sometimes it's just what's coming in the door, and sometimes it's more civil things, and sometimes it's more criminal things. I think lately I've done a lot more probably criminal evaluations than civil. But a lot of them are set up in terms of the testing, and the process of evaluation is not all that dissimilar, whether it's a civil evaluation or a criminal evaluation. The ultimate part is trying to answer those specific psycholegal questions that come up in a civil matter, whether it's child custody, or a criminal matter, whether it's mental state at the time of the offense or capacity to proceed to trial, and using the process of evaluation that we have, including a lot of psychometric testing, to try our best to answer those questions.
And so do you find that this narcissism kind of has become more prevalent within the criminal things that you've had to evaluate? Do you find this trait is maybe more prevalent in that group of people than maybe in the general population?
Certainly more than the general population, yes. I think on the criminal side, we tend to see more of the antisocial personality, but as I said previously, those things often overlap, and so it's not unusual to find folks who also meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder in addition to antisocial personality disorder. So we do see a good amount of that, and I would also say that in the juvenile clinics that I'm running, we're also seeing more of those traits. You can't diagnose a personality disorder in an adolescent, but you can certainly see those traits forming, and we've seen a lot of that in the juvenile clinics as well.
So what kind of process do you go through in trying to assess and diagnose these types of disorders?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think if you were to sit down with someone and just do an interview without relying on psychometric testing, without relying on collateral sources or information, you could probably very easily be misguided, because part of the nature of that process for them is to manipulate and misguide others to their benefit or to whatever it is that they're seeking. And certainly in criminal and civil cases, folks are out to demonstrate that they're very healthy psychologically, because it's in their best interest to do that. And so you don't get sort of the honest responses, and we frequently see that on the testing as well. So assessment in these purposes is very challenging, and it requires not only using very different and several different psychological tests, but also conducting collateral interviews with people who know this person, with previous treatment providers if they've been out there, reviewing medical records, reviewing court records, looking at as many different sources of information as you can find, so that you have a full picture.
I see. Well, in a criminal context, you said one of the things that you're doing is you're doing assessments of whether or not people are competent to stand trial, or what their mindset was at the time of the offense. And in those situations, a lot of times you're having somebody that's recommending them come to you. So they're coming there voluntarily. When it comes to something from a civil side, how many times do you have someone potentially like with a narcissistic personality disorder voluntarily come to you?
Yeah, on a civil matter, the interesting thing is we've had a couple of cases where folks who have narcissistic personality disorder are convinced that there's nothing wrong with them. And so they're convinced that they're going to come in and they're going to pass this psychological evaluation with flying colors, because they don't have a problem. In fact, we're going to acknowledge how great they are. And so they're convinced that they're going to show themselves to be very healthy and well. And so in those cases, sometimes they're not as afraid. In fact, they might, come in and ask for the evaluation because they expect that that's how it's going to turn out.
It's really interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily thought it would go that way. Yeah. But Dr. Gray, thank you so much for coming on today and providing this insight about a topic that we hear quite a bit about, because again, people, they think, time and time again that, that's their ex, that's their spouse. They see these potential tendencies, but really, I think having that diagnosis and fully understanding what it is, I think that is extremely important. So thank you for the work that you do and for coming on board today. Yeah,
thanks for having me. I just would encourage folks to make sure you reach out to your professionals to get that diagnosis before you start diagnosing your own family members. It's probably more helpful to get a clinical evaluation to determine those things. But thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And don't forget to join us next Sunday here on WTOB on For the Record with Greenwood Law. Harold Eustache is going to be back with us next week, and we're going to be discussing probation and probation violations. There are a lot of ins and outs as to how that can apply to people. A lot of times it's thought of, oh, well, they just got put on probation. No, probation is quite a significant impact on someone's life and what it can do. And there are different ways and forms and manners in which that can come about through the criminal justice system. But before we go, do not forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights. And that's first and foremost, I will not represent myself in a court of law. Second, I will not do law enforcement's job for them. 3, I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. 4, I will not consent to searches when asked by law enforcement. And 5, I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. It's not a crime to know and assert your rights. Always be mindful. That's what we're trying to do here on our program. So stay safe, stay healthy out there. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law, signing off.